Hi, welcome back to gCON 360. Just gonna wait to get started here. There's a couple viewers still trickling in. Today we have a really exciting presentation. It's actually our last presentation of the whole gCON 360 week. We've got Kyle Quinn here, who is the Director of Strategic Accounts for BetterCloud, and he will be showing you guys how to pass the Google Apps admin certification exam. So he's going to be giving an overview of the exam and hopefully giving you guys that extra push you need to get that certification that every Google Apps admin should be looking to get if you don't have it already. Some cool things during this presentation. We will be giving away a gCON swag box. So I'll be putting up the form shortly in the Showcase app, which you can access by going up to the grid in the top right of your Hangout on Air. It's a little 3x3 grid. You click in there and there's two applications. There's the Q&A app, which I'll get to in a second, and then there's the Showcase app where you'll see the form shortly once I put it up. And if you fill out that form, you will get a copy of the slides from today's presentation, as well as an entry into the contest to win a gCON swag box. We're giving away a ton of these. I think over 100 swag boxes over these presentations. And then the Q&A app, as I mentioned before, you guys can ask questions during the presentation, and Kyle will answer all your questions at the end. And this is your chance to ask anything you're wondering about. This is our last presentation we have, and Kyle is super knowledgeable about all things Google Apps. So if you even have some questions that stray outside of the admin exam, I'm sure he might be able to give you an answer there. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to Kyle now to talk to you guys about the admin certification exam. Kyle?
Great. Thank you, Dylan. Like Dylan said, my goal today is to go through an overview of the Google Apps certification exam, or admin certification exam. So with that, I'm going to share my screen and move into the presentation. So if any of you guys attended, I gave a similar presentation at the last gCON. This one is going to be fairly similar to that. There are some additional resources I'm going to cover and some additional information, but if you guys have attended that one in the past, you may see some of the information repeated. Again, the test has been very similar since they came out with it. So the content is the same, and it's really focused on what administrators do day to day. So again, my name's Kyle Quinn, and I'm the Director of Strategic Accounts at BetterCloud. Some of the things about myself. I'm certified in deployment and administration, as well as sales, although I believe the sales certification has gone away at this point, and I think they're restructuring that a little bit. I was actually one of the first 100 people certified in Google Apps deployment. I worked with Google on the beta test and went through the process of being kind of a guinea pig in the beta process when they were first starting to develop the certification exams. So I also work with BetterCloud to continue our commitment to Google certifications. It's one of the things as an organization that BetterCloud takes very serious. We want to make sure that we are extremely knowledgeable in the Google Apps space, and knowledgeable just, even more beyond what our product does, but really what administrators and people are using on a day-to-day basis within Google Apps. So along those lines, we really make a strong push to make sure that everyone on our team, everyone from our salespeople to our marketing team to our developers, all have Google Apps certifications and maintain their knowledge of the Google Apps product, environment, and ecosystem. I also previously worked to help build out a Google Apps practice from an initial migration in 2008, which was very early stages in Google Apps, to migrating over 1 million users over to the platform. And I have 17 plus years in IT. and the majority of that has been spent in messaging and collaboration. I actually started out my life as a Lotus Notes administrator and have some Lotus Notes certifications. I also spent quite a bit of time doing some Exchange administration, so I also have some Microsoft certifications around the Exchange platform and some of those. So I've done a lot with messaging and collaboration throughout the years. Kind of our agenda for today. We're going to be covering an exam overview, as well as what to study, and then some exam resources. And that's one of the things that when I get to it is kind of exciting. I think Google's added some additional resources which really help you prep for the test and are some exciting things. So our real goal today is to educate you on the different pieces of the certification test and then how to really prepare for the test. So hopefully at the end of this session, we'll have covered that fairly well. I'm going to start out with an exam overview. Kind of go through, first of all, how the test works. The administration test is a little bit different than some of the other certification tests in that it's a practical exam. So rather than answering multiple choice questions or anything like that, Google actually gives you a Google Apps domain straight out of the box, nothing set up except for your initial user. And from there, you have to actually go in and configure that domain to match what they're requesting in the test. So it's hands-on. You're going to be doing it in the Google Apps. It's not, walking through multiple choice questions. Because of the practical nature of it, it's actually graded via API. So you want to keep that in mind that as you're going through, you want to make sure that you're following the steps in the appropriate order and doing some of those kind of things, because the API just goes and validates what's configured and how things are configured. So, it's going to be, you want to make sure that you're doing everything correctly as you walk through each step of the test. One of the nice things is you don't need one of the special webcams to take the test. You can just do it on your standard webcam on your PC. So if you've got a laptop, a Mac, or whatever the case, a Chromebook, you can take it directly from there and just leverage that webcam that you have. The webcam, your test, the webcam will be taking pictures of you throughout the test, and that's really, they want to verify that you are actually the user that's taking it. They don't want one person to sign up and have another person take it. So keep in mind that it will be taking snapshots of you throughout the test. You'll also need to use Chrome or Firefox to take the test. I would recommend the one you're most familiar with. I spend my whole day in Chrome, and that's definitely the browser I recommend. But if you're more comfortable with Firefox, then it makes sense to take it in that. There's also a little bit of a process to taking the test. Some of the other tests you can sign up and take shortly after you sign up. This one works a little bit different. When you sign up, it can take up to 48 hours for you to get the notification that the test is ready for you to take. So you go onto the certification site, you sign up, you fill out all your information if you don't have an account from taking other certification tests, and then Google will actually send you an email with a link to your domain. Once you get that email, you have 7 days to take the test. So you need to find a time within that 7-day period. Keep in mind that once you schedule it and get that email and have those 7 days, there isn't a way for Google to reschedule it. So you need to make sure that you're going to have time in those 7 days. There's also not a way to extend that 7-day period. So if you're unable to take it in those 7 days, you're going to get labeled as a no-show for the exam, and you're going to have to go through the process of signing up and paying again. The nice thing about the test, and with it being graded by the API, is that your results are provided fairly shortly after you complete the test. So you'll know right away whether you have passed or failed the test. The test is a pass-fail, and I don't know what the exact percentage is on what you need to get right in order to pass. With it graded through the API, Google doesn't really give out that type of information. So some of the exam overview, and this is something that the Google has provided on the percentages of the test. So the different things that are covered, user creation, deletion, and administration, Google views as 23% of the test. Org units or OUs are 10%. Service and organizational access is 14%. Mail delivery, routing, and filtering is 18%. Calendar setting and resources, 7%. Mobile policies and device management is 8%. And then security and groups are both 10%. This is great to give you an idea of what to study and what to pay attention to. But keep in mind that you're working in a Google Apps domain. So a lot of these items cross each other. You know, for instance, there may be some security settings that you're tying to a specific organizational unit, or there might be groups that you're leveraging for security settings or those type of things. So I would make sure that you have a thorough understanding of all of these areas and also how they work together. So it's not just broken down into, you know, 23% of your test is user creation. You know, you need to use those users throughout the test. So you want to make sure that you understand how they're created and how they're managed. Some helpful hints. These are hints that, you know, talking to the people at Better Cloud who've taken the test and myself taking it have come up with to really help you study properly. Excuse me, study properly for the test and really make sure that you're ready for it. So keep in mind that you have 2 hours to complete the exam. I've talked to multiple people who've taken the test. For some people, that's plenty of time. Other people are pushing up against the time frame. So it's definitely enough, you know, if you're familiar with the control panel, if you know where things are, it's definitely enough time. If you're spending a lot of time looking through the control panel and trying to figure out, you know, where a certain report is or where this setting is, the 2 hours can suddenly become a very tight time frame. Definitely make sure that you prepare and have a 2 hour window to take the test. I wouldn't recommend trying to cram it in when you only have an hour and a half until your next meeting or something like that. As you go through, when you sign up for the test and you start taking it, they're going to provide you a list of tasks or items to do within your domain. You want to keep in mind that throughout that, some of the settings might actually be default settings. They might ask you to turn on a service that's on by default, or to set a security setting that's on by default. Don't let that confuse you. Just keep in mind that at the end, it's scored by an API. So as long as that service or that setting is in the right configuration, then you should be good for the test. So don't feel like if it's a default setting and it's already turned on, that you have to turn it off and turn it back on or anything like that. Some of the tasks that they give you, they may be potentially out of order. You know, you may need to, you know, they may have you, you know, move a user to an OU, and then your next step is to do something with that OU. There just may be some order of operation things that you want to pay attention to. My recommendation is that you read all items prior to starting a task. So the test is usually broken up into multiple sections. I would read through each item so that you kind of know what to expect and know what you're going to do, so you can make sure that you do things in the right order. The other key is, as you're going through the steps, to make sure that you're saving things as you're doing them. If you go through and set particular settings but don't hit the save button, those settings aren't saved, and obviously when the API comes through to check on it, you know, you're not going to pass the test because things weren't saved. There's a lot of areas in the control panel that will, when you do that, it'll prompt you and it'll say, hey, you haven't saved this, or you sure you want to exit, those type of things. But not all of them do that. So just pay very close attention to that, particularly when you're going through email settings. Sometimes, depending on the email settings, you might have to navigate, to other sections or deeper into the email settings. You want to make sure that you're saving the stuff before you dig deeper into the various settings within email or some of the other areas. So you just want to make sure that you're paying attention to that. The technique that I used is kind of each task that it asked me to do, if it asked me to, turn on a particular service or do this step, after each step, I made sure that I saved it. Even if 3 of the steps were on the same screen, I did step 1 and saved it, step 2 and saved it again, step 3 and saved it, just to make sure that I wasn't going to miss out on saving a setting that I had updated. Also, you want to pay close attention to your spelling and typing throughout the test. I'm by nature, I guess, a horrible speller and tend sometimes to move too fast with typing and that type of stuff. Keep in mind that if it asks you to provision a user named Fred Smith, if you mistype Fred or Smith, it's going to view that user as not being created, because when it grades it through the API, it won't be able to see a Fred Smith. It may see, an incorrect spelling of it. And again, with the API, it's either correct or not. There's no kind of halfway or partial credit or anything like that. So keep that in mind. Also keep that in mind because as you provision users, like I said, you start out with a blank domain. So as you provision users and go through the process, if you provision a user with the wrong name and then later on it asks you to move that user into an OU, and then later on asks you to put that user in a group, you've now missed all of those questions because the user wasn't created correctly, so the user's not in the OU and the user's not in the group. So you just want to make sure that as you're creating users, creating groups, creating organizational units, all those things, that you're paying very close attention to how you typed them and that they're spelled exactly like they are spelled in your list of tasks. So now that we know kind of the areas of the test and kind of how the test is going to be, I want to go through what to study. And this is really high level. Again, they gave you percentages. The percentages I listed earlier were from Google. So they kind of walk you through the different areas, but this will go kind of in more detail. Again, and you can see it's the same type of areas: user creation, groups, email settings, security, other items. But also keep in mind that this test is really intended for people that are familiar and experienced with Google Apps administration. It's meant for people that have spent 6 months to a year minimum in the Google Apps control panel. They know their way around the control panel very well. It's not really, because it's a practical test, I think it's a very difficult test to read through, a list of best practices or something like that and try to do it. You really need to have spent plenty of time in the control panel, clicking through, setting configurations, doing those type of things. User organization and management. Again, you're given a essentially blank domain. So this is where the test kind of starts from. Obviously, you can set up security settings and do some other things, and the test may have you do that. But a lot of what administrators do day to day involves users and how they configure them. So the things to pay attention to, number one, how do you get your initial user in the domain? How do you set up users when people are join your organization or leave your organization? How is that handled? And keep in mind that throughout this, there are a lot of things that you can do multiple different ways. This is a great example. You can configure user manually. You can literally click add user, type in the user's name and information, add that. There's also a bulk provisioning tool that you can use. So you can take a CSV and upload it as part of the bulk provisioning tool. You want to make sure that you're familiar and comfortable with both of those ways to provision users. They may ask you to do some one way and some the other way. Keep in mind that you want to follow the steps that the test tells you around creating the users to make sure you do it the proper way, because There is potential that if you create it with the bulk provisioning tool, it may show up a little bit different in the API than if you create it manually, depending on what exactly you're doing. You also want to make sure you're familiar with password length settings and that you can set those and configure those for the domain. You want to practice renaming users within your domain. That's a fairly common task that a lot of administrators do. But also there's a lot of administrators out there that may not do that. Maybe they're using GADs to provision and deprovision, rename users, and that happens automatically. So you want to make sure that you know how to rename a user. You also, again, on this want to pay attention to, there's a specific renaming process that you can use, but there's also a manual way to do some renaming. So you want to make sure that you're familiar with both ways and that you understand what is all happening if you use the automated process versus doing things manually. You want to be familiar with the settings to log out users or force users to change their password next time they log in, those type of settings, so that you know how to set those up. And then you also want to create an organization. Organization are fairly straightforward once you understand them. You can create them, you can create suborgs, you can move users between them. You just want to make sure you're familiar with how they're set up, where you access them, and how you move users in between. Group creation and management. This was a large portion of the exam just because there's, like I said before, depending on the exam and the questions may have changed, but there's a lot of different things you can do with groups. So part of it was the initial, similar to users, it's the initial configuring of the groups, but then it's also where you can leverage those groups to do different things, different settings within the control panel. It's also, I viewed it as a difficult portion of the test from my perspective, just because I wasn't as familiar with the group settings, and there are a lot of group settings. If you look at the picture there on the right-hand side, you can see that there's members and the settings around members, but there's also email options, moderation, permissions. There's a lot of different settings within each of those areas, and you want to make sure that you're very familiar with them, not just what the setting is called, but what it actually means and what it actually does to the group, because they may potentially ask you to set it up so that a specific action happens, and the setting may not be specifically called out. It's not going to be go to the email options setting and click this box. It's going to be make it so that all email comes in this way. So you just want to make sure you're familiar with all the settings. You also want to know the 4 different types of groups and what differentiates them from each other. So there's email lists, there's web forum, there's collaborative inbox, and there's Q&A forum. And they all have different functionality. They're all intended to do different things. And they all, by default, kind of have different settings to help them accomplish what their goal is. So you want to make sure that you're familiar with all 4 of those. Another difficulty I had with the test is that, in the domains I had worked with, almost all of our groups we had set up as email lists. So I was very familiar with that, but wasn't as familiar with the other options out there. So I had to spend a lot of time making sure that I understood those. You also want to know the different types of group access, owner, manager, and member. So you want to make sure that you know how to obviously add members to a group, remove members. You want to make sure that you can move a user so that they're an owner or manager, make a member an owner or manager, and also understand fully what those settings mean. Does an owner get an email if they're not a member of the group? Those type of things, so that you're familiar with the ins and outs of how groups work. And then, like I said at the beginning, make sure you're familiar with the settings, not just what the setting is called, but what it actually means. So again, this is an area that I wasn't very familiar with, so I spent a fair amount of time studying this, because groups are such a powerful tool, and once you get into all the different settings, it really opened my eyes to all the different things you can do with a Google group. Managing email settings. This is another area where you should focus. Again, the exam will probably ask you to perform several tasks within this area. You also want to make sure that you're familiar with some of the changes that have come into the control panel over the last several months. A lot of times with email settings, particularly as organizations move over to Google Apps, they tend to go through and configure their email settings, and then there's not necessarily a lot of change. It's not like something that it's not like creating a user that may happen every day or a couple times a week. Email settings tend to be one of those things that a lot of organizations kind of initially set and then leave. So you may not be as familiar with what the settings are. Google has made some modifications to their control panel recently that, they've added some additional functionality, but they've also reorganized a little bit on how you get to things and how things look. So make sure that you're familiar with all of those updated settings. You also want to understand spam settings and how to apply them. And this includes email whitelists and blacklists. Obviously, whitelists are people that come into your domain that are not going to be captured by spam or not going to be blocked as bulk email. And then blacklists are those addresses or domains that you want to keep out of your Google Apps domain, so you block them. You also want to know how to create and update compliance settings so that you understand how these operate, how they interact with the email when it's coming in and out, and how you adjust those settings. You should have a high-level understanding of email routing. You should know what an MX record is and those type of things, so that you understand how the email is routed, but also more importantly, beyond the MX record, you should know how it gets routed once it hits Google, and what features are, when does the spam filters get applied, when does this step, when does compliance. You want to really understand how that mail flow works, so that as they ask you to do various tasks with configuring mail flow, you really understand on a functionality level of what you're setting and why you're setting it and what the end result is going to be when email comes in. And then again, like I said earlier, there's a lot of settings that get applied in different ways. So you want to make sure you know what settings you can apply to the whole domain, what settings you can also apply to just a particular OU or a set of OUs. So you really want to understand how you can apply the different settings. Configuring service settings. This can be viewed as simple as turning on and off services for your domain. The exam may ask you to configure specific settings so that maybe services are turned on or off. There's also some that you can turn on or off based on OU, as well as set up different settings within a particular service based on OU. So you want to make sure you're familiar with those. Again, one of the most powerful tools within Google is Google Drive. So make sure that you're aware of all the security settings within there, as well as the sharing settings. Also make sure that you understand the difference between a default setting in a particular service versus a setting that's enforced in a particular service across. So, default, obviously the users can override and can change, whereas some of the other settings, once you set it in the control panel, that's the setting for all users. You also want to make sure you're familiar with creating resources within the calendar settings section. So calendar is obviously a service in Google. Part of that is resources, whether it be conference rooms, projectors, those type of things. Make sure you're familiar with how those are configured, how those are created, how those interact with the users and that type of stuff. You also want to make sure that you're familiar with the additional Google services section of the control panel. This is for things that are consumer-based services, but that you can also turn on or off in your domain. So they're Blogger, YouTube, there's several of them. And you want to make sure that you're familiar with, number one, what services are in there, just in case it asks you to update some settings on one of those services, so you'll know where to find it. But then also to know how to turn it on or off, and whether you can turn it on or off by OU, or whether it has to be on for the whole domain. There's also some services that require other services to be turned on before you can enable them. So you'll just want to go through and make sure you're testing that out so that you're not caught off guard when suddenly they ask you to activate a service and it tells you, oh, before you activate this service, you have to turn this other service on. So security settings. Obviously, administrators spend a lot of their time working through security. So the exam covers the security settings within the security section, the control panel. One of the big security settings, one of the big pushes from Google, one of their really top-notch security features is the two-step verification. So you want to make sure that you're familiar with that, you're familiar with how it works. Make sure you know how to turn that on or off. And also how you can turn it on or off to make it available for your domain, but then there's also settings around enforcing it for your domain and enforcing users to use two-step verification. So again, make sure you're familiar with the difference between them. Make sure that you understand what settings in there within two-step verification you can do based on an OU. There's also some settings that you can do based on groups. So make sure again that you're familiar with how groups versus OUs interact with the various security settings. Again, make sure that you're familiar with the password length settings, and then make sure you're familiar with the SSL settings. So again, you want to make sure that you've spent plenty of time in the security settings. This is another area that tends to be one of those that you initially configure, and then you may not go back and check, and maybe if you do it once a year, it may not be an area that you're that familiar with or haven't really spent some time clicking around. So make sure you take the time to walk through all the settings, understand each of the settings, and really work through those items. Some other items to cover. Like I said, mobile device is a percentage of the test. So make sure you understand how to turn on the mobile device settings, how to activate password settings, device locking settings, device activation settings. Also make sure you're familiar with wiping a device from the control panel, those type of things. Make sure that you've really spent some time walking through the different things. I will tell you that this can be an area that's difficult to test, particularly if you don't have a mobile device. Be careful if you set up your own domain to test things that you don't go through and accidentally wipe your mobile device, because it does do a full wipe depending on how you have it configured. So be careful as you're going through and testing and figuring this out. But it's definitely an area of the test, and definitely where you want to spend some time making sure you're familiar with it. You also want to create and configure admin roles. Understand how the admin roles work, how you apply them to users, how you can create different admin roles beyond the defaults that are in there. Make sure that you understand how those all work. You also want to pay attention to the Google settings for releasing new services to the domain. This determines when Google comes out with a new service or new items, how they roll into your domain, when they're available. Do they come in right away? Do they want to wait for you to turn them on? Those type of things. Make sure you're familiar with those. There's also a large setting or a large area called reporting and alerts. I recommend, just because the functionality is so strong, that you spend some time in the section understanding what reports are there and what data is in those reports, so that you can understand, this report has this type of data. If they're asking for me to provide this data to a certain group or whatever, that you have familiarity with the reports, and you can go in and really know not just what the report name is, but what the actual data is. There's also a lot of stuff you can do with alerts, turning on and off alerts, and how you enable those. Again, a very powerful thing. It's something that's rolled into the Google Apps domain in the last year or so, and really been enhanced in the last year or so. So it's definitely an area that it pays to spend some time in and to really look through. And then the last area I recommend you spend some time in is Google+. Google+ is a service, but there's definitely some unique features around Google+, and in that it's a It's a little bit different from Drive and Calendar and that type of stuff. And there's some uniqueness on how you enable it or disable it and those type of things. So definitely spend some time, exploring Google Plus on the service side and what you need to do to really enable that for a domain. Some of the resources, Google has done a really good job, and they've actually done a kind of a refresh of their resources that are available out there from the last time I presented this, which makes it really nice. They provide you some really strong resources to make sure that you're prepared and ready to take the admin certification test. The first one of those is, well, again, the best study guide of all is to spend time in your Google Apps domain, configuring, setting up, walking through. I mean, that's really what the test is intended for, is people that have really spent 6 months to a year running a domain with 50 plus users, that they're familiar with the settings, that they know where things are, that they're very comfortable interacting with the Google Apps domain. Like I said at the beginning, this is not really a certification test that, in its nature, I think it's very difficult to take by, the quote unquote reading a book and then taking the test. Because it is a practical test, you really have to be familiar with how things operate in the control panel. One of the great things Google has done that, like I said, I don't think was available, or at least I wasn't aware of it last time I gave this at the last gCON when I gave a similar presentation, is the Google Admin Certification course. And this is a course, if you go to admin-training.googleapps.com, it's a free course. You can take it. It walks you through. It tends to have some videos that you can listen to the video. Then it gives you a little quiz on what you learned in the video and what it went over. Keep in mind that the quizzes tend to be multiple choice questions. How do you turn on X, Y, and Z? And then it gives you multiple options. They're very good for studying, making sure that you have knowledge, making sure that you know where things are. But that's not what the test is going to be. The test is not going to be multiple choice. It's going to be go into a domain and configure this. So it's great test prep. It'll help make sure you're ready, help make sure you know where things are, that type of stuff. But keep in mind that it's not like some of the other certification tests where they're all multiple choice. So I recommend taking this. Again, there's no charge to it. You can take it multiple times. You can walk through it multiple times. It's broken up into sections, so you can, as you have time available, you can take some of it and then come back later and complete it. So very powerful tool set and really provides you a lot of information. One of the things that we did at Better Cloud, that I did also before I took the test, is I actually signed up for a 30-day trial of a Google Apps domain. This is very helpful because a lot of times, obviously in your production domain, you don't want to be changing security settings. You don't want to be turning on and off services. You don't want to be doing those type of things because it'll obviously affect your users. This allows you to have a domain, and again, it's free for a 30-day trial. You just need a domain name. So if you can go out to GoDaddy or wherever you register a domain name and just come up with a domain. If you already have a domain and you can create a subdomain, then it doesn't cost you anything, and you can set up a free 30-day trial of the Google Apps instance. This also allows you to go into a domain that is fresh and clean and just provisioned. So unlike your production domain that maybe someone else did a lot of configuration, this will show you what it's like to be the first initial user that logs into a domain, how things are configured, how things look, and that should match on your test day when you log into the domain that you're going to do your test in. It should look exactly like your domain looked at like when you logged in initially. So I highly recommend that as you start prepping and you've spent time in the control panel and you feel like you're ready, that you get your own free trial and that you spend perhaps even the full 30 days in that domain, walking through, configuring things, making sure you understand all the settings. So And like I said, if you register a domain name, depending on what you check, it's a couple bucks for a year, and then Google gives a free 30-day trial. So, and again, you can just get that at google.com/a/sign up. So, and once you've done that, once you've taken the course, once you've spent time in your Google Apps control panel, once you feel comfortable and ready for taking the test, you can go to certification.googleapps.com/admin, and that's where you can sign up for the test. There is a $100 fee for the test, so there is some cost to it. But again, if you've spent some time in the control panel, if you are comfortable with it, if you've actually administered a domain for 6 months to a year, done the right steps on studying, the test should be pretty straightforward. Just follow the best practices, like we said. Make sure you're reading through things. Make sure you're careful and conscientious of how you spell and type things, and make sure that you follow their instructions explicitly, and that you're walking through the steps as they want you to do them. So, again, good luck, guys. If you've taken the steps and done the right things, you should do very well on the test. Once you guys get through and have your admin certification, one of the other certifications that's out there that I recommend taking if you want to further your knowledge and really become an expert in the Google Apps space is the deployment exam. And that certifies you that you can do the fundamental skills and knowledges to deploy or to roll out Google Apps. Some of the things to keep in mind: this is a little bit different style of a test. This is not the practical test. You won't be doing it in a Google Apps domain. This is much more of a multiple choice test. So they're going to ask you questions and give you 5 options and say, hey, select the right one or select the right 2, those type of things. You have to have a fairly deep understanding of some of the migration tools and methods out there, including a lot of the best practices. So you want to make sure that not only do you know the different ways to do it, but what's really the best practice. This is a test that a lot of the Google partners out there and a lot of people in the partner community have taken, because they do this a lot. They're very familiar with the best practices. A lot of organizations only deploy Google Apps once, so you may not be as familiar. So you may need to really spend some time looking at the various tools and looking at the best practices. Again, this test, as with all tests, read all questions thoroughly. A lot of the questions are very detailed. There's a lot of kind of nuances in the question, and you really need to understand what they're asking to make sure that you answer the question correctly. There's often times where there's a no or a not in the question that you may read quickly and skip over, and that completely changes what they're looking for. So also keep in mind, the various mail configurations, third-party tools, and Google's own migration tools. So I do think the deployment exam is challenging, but it's also something that if you're familiar with Google Apps, if you spend some time deploying it in your own organization and you're familiar with some of the tools out there, it's a great certification to review and to have.
All right, looks like we've got a lot of questions here that are really good, so I want to jump right into them. Before I do that, I just want to remind everyone, in the Showcase application, that's the yellow one, there is a form you can fill out, and that'll get you a copy of this presentation emailed to you once you fill out that form. And it also allows you to be eligible to win a gCON swag box, which has t-shirts and a bunch of other cool goodies from some of the sponsors. So having said that, let's jump into the exam. Jump into the questions, sorry. Surprise, you're taking the exam right now.
All right.
So the first question we've got is from Chad, and he's asking, are you allowed to use notes during the exam? Basically, is the test open book?
I don't believe the test is by its nature open book. It's something you'd have to ask Google on, but it's not, you're not proctored with someone actually, taking pictures of you. But I think it's intended to be a practical exam where you do it within the control panel. So I don't believe that it's considered open book.
Awesome. Our next question. Is there a practice mock exam that can be taken before the real thing?
So within the Google certification course, they ask you specific questions. Again, it's not a practice exam because they're multiple choice questions, but it'll highlight the areas where you need to study. What I would recommend is, as you go through those questions, and at the end of each section, it asks you 3 or 4 questions. If you have your Google Apps domain already provisioned, you could actually, as it asks you about those questions, go into the free 30-day domain and go in and configure those items that it's asking about. But I don't know of any practice tests or sample exams that you can take before you actually take the test.
Cool. So you can sort of make your own practice exam.
Yeah.
So to speak.
Yep.
So this is one I think a lot of people are wondering. I had to deal with this as well because I took the exam a little bit ago. How often do you have to retake this exam to maintain the certification?
I believe it's on an annual basis.
Actually looking, I think it's 18 months
18
actually.
months. That's
Yep.
right. Sorry.
It's all right.
It is 18 months, and they do, they'll send you an email when you're, I think 30 days prior to your certification expiring, or a certain period prior, they will send you an email reminding you that your certification is up for renewal. And then you have to take the test again. So.
Great. Let's see. Oh, this is a really interesting question. So, is there a difference in the type of domain? So if you if you use a Google Apps for education domain and the exam is configured for business, how much difference will there be?
So there are some subtle differences between an EDU domain or a Google Apps for Government domain versus a Google Apps for Business domain. They're fairly small, and if you go out and do some research and Google on it, you can find out what those are. I would recommend that you do, again, 98-99% of the domain is going to be the same, and the settings are going to be in the same area. But I would recommend that if you're used to working in an EDU domain or a Gov domain, that you make sure that your test domain that you set up is a business domain, because the test will be on a business domain. So, and the differences aren't large. Like when you log into the domain, your test domain, you're going to be able to, everything's going to look very familiar and that type of stuff. It's just as you drill down into some of the settings, there's some minor changes.
Great. So I think that's where that 30-day trial would probably come in handy, so you can get familiar with some of those business aspects before you take it.
Absolutely.
Let's see. So Chris Jones wants to know, can you skip a part of the test while taking it and then return to that part before the end of the 2-hour window? So do you have to take it linearly, or can you sort of move around?
So the short answer is yes, you can move around, but keep in mind that there are some things that are order of operation. So, if if in one section of the test you have to create a user or rename a user, and then in another section of the test you have to put that user in a group or put that user in an OU, you won't be able to do that. You are able to, the test is graded all at once. So once you complete it and say, I'm done, and hit the button, then it runs the API. So it's not going to hurt you if you, jump down and create a group, before you create a user. It's not going to know what you did first. But I would be extremely careful doing that, just because as you go through the steps, you want to make sure that you're not, that you're doing it in the right order so that you can actually complete all the steps. You also want to, because it's not a multiple choice where you can go back and say, okay, I've answered question, 1 through 50 or whatever, skipping around, I think it could be very easy to miss a step or miss a task, and then have to deal with that. So
definitely, I as well would recommend taking it linearly, just so you can I think it leads you through the natural progression of things.
Yep.
So it'd make more sense to take it in order rather than to skip around. But it might help to sort of read what you have to do ahead of time, so that way you can know and be prepared for it. But in terms of the actual operations, I think Kyle was spot on. So Jason wants to know, is the test always based off the current admin console?
Yeah, it is. So they literally provision you a domain. So they're gonna, when you get that email, you're gonna click and log in, and you're gonna be, user XYZ at this domain. So it should be the most recent, version of Google Apps that's out there.
Okay. So let's see. Uday wants to know if he can use a Mac or a PC. So, I mean, it's an online exam, so considering that it's over the internet, as long as you have a web browser, you should be able to take it. It shouldn't matter what type of computer you're using. Is that correct?
That's correct. Just keep in mind that browser-wise, Firefox or Chrome. And I'd recommend that, both of those are updated to the latest version before you go in. The last thing you'd want is to have Firefox suddenly want to update on you in the middle of the exam or something like that. So I would just make sure that you're up with the latest version of each of those browsers, and you can do it on a PC or a Mac.
Okay, good to know. Jack wants to know how much the exam costs.
I believe in the US it's $100 for the exam. I haven't looked globally, but
Straightforward answer for a straightforward question. Okay. This is a good one. So as a current admin of a Google Apps domain, I use some third-party tools to help manage users and groups. Do you know if I, as a test taker, can set up those tools? Example tool, Google Apps Manager or something like that, or maybe using Better Cloud to use some of the, complete some of the tasks during the exam. What is the deal with third-party tools?
So the exam is intended that you take it and you do everything within the control panel. Everything that they ask you to do, they want you to do in the control panel with Google's tools. So you want to make sure that you're not leveraging GAM or some other solution, that you're using the tools within the control panel, because that's really what they're testing you on. Again, there's, like you said, Better Cloud, some of the other tools that are out there can really help make some of the processes easier, but you want to make sure you do it in the control panel, because that's what they're really testing.
All right, and that's all we have for questions. And just before we wrap it up, I just want to give a big thank you to everyone who's made this gCON possible. This is our last session, and this is my first time sort of working on gCON as the guru. So I just want to give a special thank you to our 5 featured sponsors: AODocs, Smartsheet, Spanning by EMC, Switch.co, and Virtru. If it weren't for them, we wouldn't be giving away Chromebook Pixels for you guys. So that was very generous, and they also provided some amazing sessions. And also the rest of our sponsors put a lot into those swag boxes and helping us come up with some of these sessions and making this a possibility. So big thank you to everyone. Also the Moto 360 watch is thanks to them. And of course, thanks to everyone who tuned in. We had over 1,000 viewers for these gCON sessions, which was really amazing to see. And to all our presenters, Kyle and everyone who presented before. I'll be sharing out all the sessions to everyone who subscribes to the Guru newsletter. So if you want to rewatch anything, make sure you subscribe and keep an eye out for that email coming soon. And make sure you fill out the form so you can get the slide deck. Big thank you to everyone, and have a great night.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.